Just a friendly reminder, ladies and gentlemen, if you advocate for political violence against your opponents, you're a fascist. The more political violence you advocate, the more fascist you are. I guess that means that Walter Rodizio, an Italian communist partisan, was actually a fascist, despite him killing Mussolini for being, well, a fascist. How you going, lads? Batco here. To any leftist, be it Marxist or anarchist, PragerU is the gift that just keeps on giving. With takes so nuclear, it'd give Chernobyl a run for its money. Even more fascinating is the fact that it's called a university despite it just being a non-profit digital media organization that serves more or less as a conservative think tank. And boy howdy, does it really make you think. With such intellectuals such as Stephen I shall whip out my dick to make fun of the quote mentally sick Crowder and Dave free marketplace of Spurgouts Rubin. It's bound to activate those almonds and make you feel like a big-brained Wojak by the end of it. So, when PragerU is making excuses for imperialism, excusing the acts of genocidal regimes, and basically sucking America's star-bangled testicles, I think it's best that we analyze one of their most recent videos. Is fascism right or left?
Let's find out.
He's a fascist. For decades, this has been a favorite smear of the left aimed at those on the right. Every Republican president, for that matter, virtually every Republican, since the 1970s has been called a fascist, now more than ever. This label is based on the idea that fascism is a phenomenon of the political right. The left says it is, and some self-styled white supremacists and neo-Nazis embrace the label. But are they correct?
Fascism wouldn't necessarily be considered leftist by most standards of any Marxist or anarchist philosopher or economist, as fascism has often been a reactionary ideology. For example, in a source by Alexander J. de Grand, Mussolini's fascist party abandoned republicanism, populist and anti-clerical rhetoric in favor of a free enterprise fascism that was compatible with the church and monarchy. It should, however, be noted that fascism isn't necessarily a single school of thought. Like communism, there are variations that have their own interpretations. However, it has never been disputed that fascists have been strictly anti-leftist. Throughout history, governments often categorized as fascist sought to crush radical leftist organizations, from Mussolini attacking communists with the black shirts, Hitler crushing trade unions and imprisoning communists, and of course Franco's war against the anarchists of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. On top of that, fascism being used as a label by the left to insult Republicans is mostly used as a pejorative from people from the left. For example, after 1941, fascist was used in the Soviet Union to describe virtually any anti-Soviet activity or opinion. According to Marxist-Leninist communists, in some cases, fascism was the final phase of crisis of the bourgeoisie, which in fascism sought refuge from inherent contradictions of capitalism. As a result of this, Western capitalist countries were often deemed fascist, with the Third Reich being the most reactionary one. So basically, PragerU is taking an insult flung at Republicans and using it to turn around and say, "Nuh-uh, you leftists are the real fascists!" Classy move, PragerU. Classy move indeed.
To answer this question, we have to ask what fascism really means. What is its underlying ideology? Where does it even come from? These are not easy questions to answer. We know the name of the philosopher of capitalism, Adam Smith. We know the name of the philosopher of Marxism, Karl Marx. But who's the philosopher of fascism? Yes, exactly. You don't know. Don't feel bad, almost no one knows. This is not because he doesn't exist, but because historians, most of whom are on the political left, had to erase him from history in order to avoid confronting fascism's actual beliefs.
So, let me get this straight. Fascism believes in dissolving the state, abolishing class, be it economic or social, creating forms of horizontal democracy, replacing a capitalist economy with a gift economy, equality within the workplace, dismantling the nuclear family to establish an expanded one, ending alienation and surplus extraction, which is perpetuated by the capitalist class, while embracing historical materialist theory as well as advocating for the rights of workers to have control within their own workplace? What the fuck? I love fascism now.
So let me introduce him to you. His name is Giovanni Gentile. Born in 1875, he was one of the world's most influential philosophers in the first half of the 20th century. Gentile believed that there were two diametrically opposed types of democracy. One is liberal democracy, such as that of the United States, which Gentile dismisses as individualistic, too centered on liberty and personal rights, and therefore selfish. The other, the one Gentile recommends, is true democracy, in which individuals willingly subordinate themselves to the state. Like his philosophical mentor Karl Marx, Gentile wanted to create a community that resembles the family, a community where we are all in this together. It's easy to see the attraction of this idea. Indeed, it remains a common rhetorical theme of the left. For example, at the 1984 convention of the Democratic Party, the governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, likened America to an extended family, where, through the government, people all take care of each other. Nothing's changed. 30 years later, a slogan of the 2012 Democratic Party convention was, "The government is the only thing we all belong to." They might as well have been quoting Gentile.
Now, these are some pretty grand claims from PragerU. So let's break each of these down. Due to political influence from Marx, does this make Gentile a student of Marx, or a leftist for that matter? Did Gentile actually believe in a form of democracy? And do fascists believe in an extended family? Well, firstly, let's look at Gentile being a quote-unquote student of Marx. While this is true that Marx, even Hegel, had an influence on his works, Gentile also drew heavily from Nietzsche and Fichte, the latter of which was an ardent nationalist. Now, firstly, the question must be asked, did Gentile utilize any of Marx's teachings into his application of fascism? And secondly, what is to be said of his embracement of leftist thought, that being the thought that came from Marx? Now, PragerU later says in the video that Gentile's thoughts were brought into the spotlight within the Doctrine of Fascism, which was not only written by Gentile, but Mussolini himself, who collaborated with Gentile in placing forth the philosophy of fascism. So, what does this doctrine, the source of which you can find in the description of this video below, say in regards to leftist ideologies? Well, within the Doctrine of Fascism, in a section titled The Rejection of Marxism, we can probably get a better insight as to what fascists believe. Such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historic materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle and by the changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else. That the vicissitudes of economic life, discoveries of raw materials, new technical processes and scientific inventions have their importance, no one denies, but that they suffice to explain human history to the exclusion of other factors is absurd. Fascism believes now and always in sanctity and heroism, that is to say, in acts in which no economic motive, remote or immediate, is at work. Having denied historic materialism, which sees in men mere puppets on the surface of history, appearing and disappearing on the crest of the waves, while in the depths of the real directing forces move and work, fascism also denies immutable and irreparable character of the class struggle, which is the natural outcome of this economic conception of history. Above all, it denies that the class struggle is the preponderating agent in social transformations. Now, maybe we should just give PragerU some slack. I'm sure that maybe they might be referring, of course, to fascism as being an entirely different sort of socialism. I mean, after all, PragerU likes to insist that fascism somehow has a form of democracy. You know what? How about we look into the same source that PragerU likes to cite? No individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but the class struggle. Fascism denies that the majority, through the mere act of being a majority, can rule human societies. It denies that this majority can govern by means of periodical consolation. It affirms the irredeemable, fruitful, and beneficent inequality of men who cannot be leveled by such a mechanical and extrinsic fact as universal suffrage. Really feeling the democracy and socialism from this one, lads. Now, PragerU starts to make a comparison between leftists and fascists and consider themselves similar because they view the society that they want to achieve as one big family, an extended family. I mean, I could go on about how totally leftist the Democrats are, because committing acts of imperialism from the Bay of Pigs to the war in Syria, both of which were oversaw by a Democrat president, never happened. But hey, I digress, and I'll touch on government ownership later in this video. Now, fascists such as Mussolini sought to maintain the structure of the nuclear family and enforce traditional gender roles, and just treat women as liable breeding stock. So, if Tara McCarthy is wondering why alt-right men treat her like shit, well, here's something that might help her understand women's positions under fascism. In an effort to increase birth rates, the Italian fascist government gave financial incentives to women who raised large families and initiated policies intended to reduce the number of women employed. In Alexander de Grand's Italian fascism, Mussolini called for women to be honored as reproducers of the nation, and the Italian fascist government held ritual ceremonies to honor women's roles within the Italian nation, literally giving them gold medals. In 1934, Mussolini declared that employment of women was a major aspect of the thorny problem of unemployment, and that for women, working was incompatible with childbearing. Mussolini went on to say that the solution to unemployment for men was the exodus of women from the workforce. In Alexander de Grand's The Historical Journal, Mussolini stressed that women were to be excluded from the industrial world and remain within the rural area where the home and family were central. Now, due to the enforcement and stress of patriarchal family structures, as well as traditionalist gender roles, as well as the emphasis on men being the sole breadwinners of the family, this makes it a nuclear family, not an extended one by any margin. But just wait, fellas, just wait, because believe me, it gets better.
Now remember, Gentile was a man of the left. He was a committed socialist. For Gentile, fascism is a form of socialism, indeed, its most workable form.
Despite Gentile rejecting Marxist theory and wanting to crush socialism with Mussolini, as stated within the Doctrine of Fascism.
While the socialism of Marx mobilizes people on the basis of class, fascism mobilizes people by appealing to their national identity as well as their class. Fascists are socialists with a national identity. German fascists in the 1930s were called Nazis, basically a contraction of the term National Socialist.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Thomas Sankara, who is recognized for being one of the founders of Pan-African theory, who conducted a Marxist revolution, who opposed French colonialism and imperialism and the debt placed upon them by these powers, who distributed lands to peasants, which wasn't a very common thing within Africa during the time, who opposed forced marriages and polygamy while also allowing women to hold political positions within his cabinet, was a fascist? Abdullah Öcalan, I hope I'm saying that right, who created the ideology of democratic confederalism, started a revolution in Syria to fight for the rights of Kurdish people, workers who advocated for women's rights within the Middle East, workers' control, libertarian municipalism, and inspired a group of Kurds to actively fight against those that would see his people ethnically cleansed and denied a home, is a fascist. Subcomandante Marcos, one of the founders of Neo-Zapatismo theory, who led the Zapatistas in a revolution against the Mexican government, a revolution formed of indigenous workers and farmers who sought to have control over the lands that they worked, as well as opposing economic globalization while embracing anarchist tendencies and focusing on women's rights, is a fascist. Well, in that case...
Come on down,
jeez! I mean, I've seen some hot takes calling leftists fascists, but, you know, hot damn, this gets my cortex in a vortex. Also, in regards to the Nazis being socialist, you do realize that Hitler killed off the left wing of the Nazi party in the Night of the Long Knives, yes? In which SS officers and the Gestapo killed off the Strasserite faction of the Nazi party. Or maybe the fact that Hitler sought to abolish trade unions, and in regards to the state owning property, which Prager U loves to call socialism for some fucking manner, especially in regards to the Nazi party, you do realize that Nazi Germany sold a good chunk of their state assets. A good chunk of their industrial sectors and banks was sold off for finance, and the Nazi state did not remain active shareholders. I mean, I could go, on about how the Nazis also sought to crush communists during their time, but, hey, they have socialist in their name, because, so all of a sudden, hey, that makes it all good. So, you know what, guys, fellas? The Communist Party of China, that must be communist. Yeah, all that imperialism that's been conducted in Africa, nah, that's not real. Just like how they don't smash trade unions and crush workers' strike within China. Really film.
That's communism and that's socialism and that's shit!
For Gentile, all private action should be oriented to serve society. There's no distinction between the private interest and the public interest. Correctly understood, the two are identical. And who is the administrative arm of society? It's none other than the state. Consequently, to submit to society is to submit to the state, not just in economic matters, but in all matters. Since everything is political, the state gets to tell everyone how to think and what to do.
Yes, because every single socialist wants to utilize the institution of a state to create a classless, moneyless, stateless society.
It was another Italian, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy from 1922 to 1943, who turned Gentile's words into action. In his Doctrine del Fascismo, one of the doctrinal statements of early fascism, Mussolini wrote, "All is in the state, and nothing human exists or has value outside the state." He was merely paraphrasing Gentile.
The same Gentile who rejected Marxism and socialism altogether within the very same doctrine you parrot.
The Italian philosopher is now lost in obscurity.
Yeah, not anymore, he's not.
But his philosophy could not be more relevant because it closely parallels that of the modern left. Gentile's work speaks directly to progressives who champion the centralized state. Here in America, the left has vastly expanded state control over the private sector, from healthcare to banking, from education to energy. This state-directed capitalism is precisely what German and Italian fascists implemented in the 1930s.
Now, I may as well point out the fact that just because it is state-owned or a service is provided by the state doesn't mean that that property or service that is owned or provided by the state is socialist. For example, am I supposed to believe that Otto von Bismarck was somehow a socialist, considering the fact that he created the first welfare state in the modern world? Just because a few institutions are placed under state control, this isn't necessarily enough to consider it to be socialist. The state, like the private sector, extracts surplus value for those who work for them. A criticism that anarchists such as myself have for the state controlling the means of production can even be found within our criticism of the USSR. From an article from the Anarchist FAQ titled, "What was the Kronstadt Rebellion?" it reads as follows. Rather than present an effective and efficient means of achieving revolution, the Leninist model is elitist, hierarchical, and a highly inefficient form of achieving a socialist society. At best, these parties play a harmful role in the class struggle by alienating activists and militants with their organizational principles and manipulative tactics within popular structures and groups. At worst, these parties can seize power and create a new form of class society, a state capitalist one, in which the working class is oppressed by new bosses, namely the party hierarchy and its appointees. Even Lenin himself realized that state capitalism wasn't something to be necessarily desired, and only saw state capitalism as a temporary necessity in the dictatorship of the proletariat when he introduced the NEP. From Lenin's own State and Revolution, he writes, "The state will be able to wither away completely when society adopts the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, i.e., when people have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse and when their labor has become so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. The narrow horizon of bourgeois law, which compels one to calculate with the heartlessness of a Shylock whether one has not worked half an hour more than anybody else, this narrow horizon will be then left behind. There will be no need for society in distributing the products to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will take freely according to his needs." So, unless these policies are somehow being conducted by a secret group of Marxist-Leninist communists who have somehow infiltrated the American government and are imposing a secret dictatorship of the proletariat, this is a crock of shit. Now, if you want to see more details as to what makes a social democrat and what makes a democratic socialist, because I'm sure that by some shape or form, someone is going to call Bernie Sanders a socialist, I've done a video with the lads at Lefty Poll videos that highlights the differences between the two, the link of which you can find in the description.
Leftists can't acknowledge their man Gentile because that would undermine their attempt to bind conservatism to fascism.
So, just to be clear, we should embrace a philosopher who has explicitly rejected Marxist theory and socialism.
Conservatism wants small government so that individual liberty can flourish.
Right. Because individual liberty will surely flourish under capitalism. Yeah, I mean, it's not like I'm alienated from the product of my labor, the active labor, and from my other co-workers because I have to work in order to sustain myself and pay rent. Yeah, wow, wage slavery is one hell of a step to
The left, like Gentile, wants the opposite, to place the resources of the individual and industry in the service of a centralized state. A centralized state. A centralized state.
A centralized state.
To acknowledge Gentile is to acknowledge that fascism bears a deep kinship to the ideology of today's left.
And to acknowledge PragerU is to acknowledge that there are actual people who believe the shit that you spew.
So they will keep Gentile where they've got him, dead, buried, and forgotten.
Hopefully, where I will also be able to see PragerU within the next few years.
We should remember, or the ghost of fascism will continue to haunt us. I'm Dinesh D'Souza for Prager University.
And I'm Batko the Manarchist, and I say this with the best intentions at heart. Go fuck yourself.
You serious?